Chief Lavelle. Chief Lavelle will allow Representative Sanchez to make a few remarks, and then Carrie Timchuk from the Oregon Historical Society will say some things, and then we'll open it up to your questions. I will help direct who's asking the questions and who will reply, so I appreciate your help with that. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mayor Wheeler. Thank you for being here this morning.
Good morning. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day. Portland has one of the largest urban populations of Native Americans of any city anywhere in the United States. This day highlights the need for racial justice and equity for all people in our community. So it's unfortunate that yesterday a group of individuals acting under what they described as the Indigenous Peoples Day of Rage co-opted what is otherwise a peaceful opportunity for education and reflection and celebration of the achievements, the accomplishments of the Native American community, and instead engaged in acts of criminal destruction here in Portland. We're obviously deeply troubled by this. My administration has been in conversations with Laura John, who's the director of our Tribal Relations Program here in the city of Portland. We've also engaged at the national level with Dr. Leneda Warjak. She's a nationally recognized tribal expert. She'll have more to say later this morning. I want to be clear, these acts are obscene. They're an affront to the values of this community. As mayor, I will never tolerate or condone violence or criminal destruction. The Oregon Historical Society was one of the institutions that was targeted last night. The Oregon Historical Society has gone out of its way to reflect the truth of Oregon history and educate the public about all aspects of Oregon history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it's ironic that this was the institution that was chosen to be attacked by this anarchist behavior. I want to also be clear that the importance of our tribal relations with our local and our regional tribal governments, it's paramount to everything we do here at the City of Portland. And that's why we have expanded and elevated our tribal relations program here at the City of Portland. We work with the urban Native American community, with grassroots leaders, with tribal governments, and we value those relationships. I'm going to now turn this over to our police chief, Chuck Lavelle, who's going to give you a little more detail about what actually happened last night and why.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'm going to give a little bit of overview of what happened last night. We didn't send out a press release last night. We're going to be finalizing one this morning and sending it out a little bit later. So last night, a group of about 300 people came into downtown Portland. They came down West Burnside to Broadway and then down to the park blocks. This group was intent on committing acts of criminal violence and mayhem. They toppled several historic statues. They did damage to several businesses in the South Park Blocks area, damage to a restaurant, broke out countless windows. A gun was fired through the restaurant, and an attempt was made to burn down the Oregon Historical Society building. We knew some days in advance that this event was going to take place. It was being touted as a day of rage. It was also being touted as a non-family friendly event. Participants were encouraged to come wearing all black with masks, and live streamers, journalists, and photographers were encouraged not to come and threatened not to show up as well. This gave us some indication that these folks wanted to engage in criminal activity and reduce their risk of being caught. Many in the group were wearing all black masks, body armors, helmets, and carrying shields. Portland Police added additional resources to the events last night. As the group came into the Southwest Park blocks, they put straps and chains around the Teddy Roosevelt statue and pulled it down using a vehicle. According to Portland Parks and Recs, that statue has been there for almost a century. The crowd then turned its attention to the Abraham Lincoln statue at Park and Madison. That statue dates back to 1928, and that was also pulled down to the ground. About the same time that these efforts to destroy these statues was taking place, we received information about a shooting in the area of Southeast 25 in Clinton, someone firing shots in a neighborhood. Additional resources were dispatched from the downtown events to the southeast side to deal with this incident. Multiple callers reported this information of shots being fired, this individual pointing a firearm at people. Officers attempted to take this person into custody, and this person fled on foot. Officers followed this person, tracked them through a neighborhood, and were able to safely take them into custody on the porch of a residence. So this was all taking place as the violence was escalating downtown as well. That person who was taken into custody on the porch of the resident was also armed with a loaded firearm. Fortunately, no one was injured, and that had the potential to be a very violent, potentially deadly situation. So we're thankful that that ended peacefully. So at the Historical Society, several windows were broken out, and there were at least three lit flares thrown into the structure in an apparent attempt to start fires. Fortunately, those flares extinguished themselves and were not involved in doing any serious damage to the building. The march then proceeded towards Portland State University, where several windows were broken out of their public safety building. This event was declared a riot, and officers attempted to disperse the crowd. There was shots fired into a restaurant, 2 bullet holes through the front window that lodged in the back of the restaurant. Windows were broken at several restaurants, a jewelry store, a bank, and a coffee shop as well. Targeted arrests were made, including numerous arrests for a person who broke numerous windows. That suspect was also armed with a loaded pistol. The driver of the vehicle used to pull over the statue was also arrested, and another person was arrested for being involved in an assault. In total, 3 arrests were made. Anyone who has information about the shootings in particular or the arson at the Oregon Historical Society, we're very interested in getting any information that you may have, as well as anyone who has any other information regarding the damage that took place on the South Park blocks. We'll continue to investigate and do follow-up on these cases, and we hope to make additional arrests as the situation warrants. And we're relieved that last night there were no reported serious injuries and no deaths. What took place was extremely dangerous with just a large number of people in the downtown, clearly intent on doing damage, firing firearms in park blocks where there's people and residents. We are 5 months into this, and we still have a fairly high level of violence taking place. We need to all come together and really be mindful about what we want as a city, what we're willing to tolerate. These events late at night, they purport to have a racial justice nexus, but they're not that. They're about violence and criminal destruction, and they're really hurting our community, and we all deserve better. That's all I have.
Shorter individual here. Good morning. I'm going to just tell you, first of all, I do not speak for the entire Indigenous population here in the state of Oregon or anywhere. But what I am going to tell you is that the majority of the Indigenous people that I communicate with on a consistent basis and other people who have talked to us are all saying that this is not our moment in time. And we as Indigenous people stand with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's what this moment is about. The fact that someone would hijack Indigenous Peoples Day to cause more violence is not appropriate. It's not appropriate in any of these situations. So I just wanted to be really, really clear about that. We know, and in particular as people of color, that violence doesn't work for us. We know that during the time of Standing Rock, the elders told us that the violence was not going to help. And so people stayed anti-violent all the time. They did not do that. We also know, just in reality here, that we cannot tear down a system using fire or rocks or destruction and then build it back up from nothing. We have to take things one piece at a time, change process, change the different things that have been systemic in our country, and build it back up in the best way possible so that it serves everyone, not just one population or another. I want to say, too, that, in my opinion, the destruction of the Oregon Historical Society in any way, shape, or form is unconscionable, because that place is so amazingly a part of the actual truth of our state. And the Oregon Historical Society has done an amazing job of late really recognizing their importance to this process, to being able to speak out to the things that we know were wrong, and helping us to try to change them. And to destroy that is to destroy the past. We have to grow and learn from the past. We cannot just dismiss it and make it go away and act as if something is going to be better afterwards. That's been a truth forever. We have to learn from the past to make it better. So I just wanted to say those few things because I think it's so very, very important that we recognize violence is not the answer. If we want to change the statutes in the city of Portland, we can do that through the city process. There is a process to make that happen if we want to change things. We don't have to do it by tearing things down because it's not helping. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie Timchuk, Executive Director of the Oregon Historical Society. And just following up on the reports, first report on the damage done. Most of the damage was done to the windows. The vast majority of the windows in our pavilion were either completely destroyed or damaged. There were some flares, as the police chief said, thrown into the building. Thankfully, they did little, if any, damage, a few marks on the carpet. Our collection is safe. They did not get into the exhibits. There was one item that was being on display in the pavilion. It was a beautiful African-American heritage bicentennial quilt that was made by 15 African-American women in this community. It took them 3 years, from 1974 to 1976, was displayed during the bicentennial, traveled the country. We recently were asked to put it on display again and had it on display this month. It was taken last night. Thankfully, the police discovered it several blocks away this morning and was returned wet, very wet, but I think hopefully it'll be able to be displayed again. It's a priceless piece of history here. I appreciate the remarks of the mayor and the state representative. We at the Historical Society have been very, very proud of the work we've been doing to share the history of all Oregonians. We are 501c3, but we do get support from the county and from the state. We take that seriously to tell the true history of all Oregonians. Whether we just opened up a fabulous new permanent exhibit last year called Experience Oregon, which has won 2 national awards for how open it is, how honest it is, as the mayor said, about the good, the bad, and the ugly of Oregon history. We worked very closely throughout the years as we put this exhibit together with all 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon to make sure that we were telling their story correctly and accurately. Earlier this year, we sparked many conversations in Portland and around Oregon with a special issue of our Oregon Historical Quarterly devoted entirely to the white supremacist past and the racist incidents in Oregon history. As I say often, our job at the Historical Society is not to be the Chamber of Commerce and not to be the Tourism Bureau. Our job as the Historical Society to tell the true and accurate history of Oregon, to share that history, and we are very proud of how we do that. One sign of hope this morning was when I came into the office first thing this morning. This had been dropped off at the front desk. It's a dollar bill and a note written on a napkin. And the note says, "Hello, I'm homeless, so I don't have much to give to you, just some of my bottle collecting money. But I saw your windows got broken, and I wanted to help. You once gave me a free tour before the pandemic, so this is a thank you." Signed by a fellow named Oscar. So to Oscar and to all those, to Oscar, I would say that we've been fortunate to receive many generous donations to OHS over the years, some upwards of $1 million and more dollars. No donation means more to me and to the society than this dollar donation from Oscar. And to Oscar and to all those, I would assure you that we will continue to do our work. We will continue to share the true and accurate history of Oregon. And I think one of the lessons of history here in Oregon and across the country is that true change comes not through vandalism, but through conversation, through discussion, through understanding, through education, and through learning. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My question is for Chief Lavelle. Do I ask here?
Yeah, if you don't mind. Go ahead. Over here. Try to be some distance.
Sorry, Everett Davis with Oregon.
Everett.
I was hoping you can elaborate on the different types of responses, the police response between Saturday's protest and Sunday's protest. I mean, both were known in advance by the police bureau, but dozens of people were arrested before any action happened on Saturday, whereas you mentioned on Sunday it was known in advance that people were apparently going to be there to commit criminal acts of violence. And I think you said 3 people were arrested.
Yeah.
And officers weren't there in advance. So can you describe what the rationale there was?
Yeah, on Saturday night, the crowd was much smaller, and they were coming to North Precinct. And we've had a lot of experience with the crowds coming to North Precinct. We didn't know in advance, for the most part, about the Saturday night activity, but we did have a lot of resources there, and we were able to intervene in that instance pretty quickly when that crowd was blocking the street. We gave them an opportunity to not block the street, and then we had the resources there to actually effect arrest, and we decided to do that early. We've had a lot of experience at North Precinct with this type of crowd, the damage they inflict, the destruction, their ability to potentially set fires and things of that nature. So the opportunity to interdict there early was to our benefit, and we did that. The difference on Sundays, we knew a crowd was gathering, but we didn't know where they were going. And we didn't have quite as many resources, and the resources we had were pulled away also to deal with the incident in Southeast. But also when there's shots being fired during this crowd event too, it really impacts your ability to really move in numbers and do any real crowd control. You have to be very careful when you know people are armed and firing weapons in that vicinity as well. So I think those are some of the real reasons that those look different between Saturday night and Sunday. I don't have the name of the restaurant. I think we can get that for you though.
Chief Eric Patterson, KGW. I believe you said at least one person arrested involving the statues.
Yes.
How do the federal guidelines involving statues come into play in this case?
I'm not sure if they do at this time. We're still investigating, still pretty early in this event. We do believe we have the person involved in pulling down the statues. So as this investigation continues, we might get some better insight into that.
I was familiar, but are you saying there was just one person involved in pulling down the statues?
Not necessarily. I think we made arrest of one person involved in that particular activity.
Other questions for the chief?
Do we know the specific group that formed to meet last night? Do they have like a name or anything, or are they like a specific group? Or?
You know, I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to put a name out there without being totally sure, but there were some indications that a group was meeting and that they had planned to engage in this type of activity.
Do you know if any of them involve indigenous peoples groups?
I don't know that for sure, no.
The questions for the chief. Questions for others.
I have just questions here.
Morning.
So you're quite far into 5 months at this point. I'm curious if you think that the police are becoming more successful or improving their response, and what success looks like for you.
So I meet with literally thousands of Portlanders from every corner of this city. And what I'm hearing from Portlanders is a combination of anxiety, frustration, and, yes, anger. And the reason they're frustrated is because they see all of these crises hitting the city of Portland at the same time. COVID, the resulting economic downturn, the nightly violence that we're seeing on our streets. Because of federal guidelines, we actually had to move people out of our shelters to encourage physical distancing. We were directed not to do our camp cleanup protocols, so we're seeing more and more people on our streets, and people are justifiably upset about that. And as a native Portlander, I understand it and I share their frustration. In terms of are we making progress, I would say if you look at the trend overall, yes. The number of people engaging in violence and criminal destruction has gone down, but then we see flashpoints like what happened last night, where we have literally hundreds of people show up to engage in acts of criminal destruction. And the strategy is going to be multifaceted. Number one, it starts with people in leadership like me saying clearly and unequivocally that I will not tolerate and I denounce violence and criminal destruction. And then it starts with engaging the community and having other leaders in the community. And we just heard from two very prominent leaders in our community, Representative Sanchez and Oregon Historical Society Director Carrie Timchuk, who are both highly respected people in this community, expressing their lack of tolerance for this kind of behavior. Then there's the public safety side, the criminal justice side of the equation. As the police chief indicated, it's about containing that violence, de-escalating it as much as possible. And by the way, Chief, I want to thank you and others in the Portland Police Bureau who de-escalated what could have been a very serious situation with the shooter in Southeast Portland. And then it's about making targeted arrests of people who are actually engaged in criminal activity, as happened last night. And then there are other parts of the criminal justice system as well. The prosecutors who work for the Multnomah County District Attorney, they need to prosecute these cases, and the courts need to hold people accountable. So it's a spectrum of things that need to happen, and I'm seeing our community come together in a unified way across the board, denouncing violence, denouncing criminal destruction, holding people accountable when they're engaged in acts of violence or criminal destruction, and also the community building work we're doing to respond to the tens of thousands of people who are engaged in nonviolent demonstrations calling for racial justice and equity and police reform. And that's the work that I am doing with my colleagues on the City Council and other community partners to show that we hear and we understand and that we will heed those calls for action around police reform. And those things collectively, I think, will de-escalate the violence we're seeing. As I see, the energy has, in terms of a long-term trend line, the energy has definitely come out, but then every once in a while we have a flashpoint like this. And so We just need to keep the pressure on, and we need to keep saying that if you are here engaging in acts of violence or criminal destruction, we do not tolerate it, we will not tolerate it, and we'll do our level best to hold you accountable. Do we know the answer to that? We can get back to you. I don't have that answer with me right now.
Last week, Commissioner Hardesty said she was concerned about the gun violence. We have a number of shootings, almost 600 now, but she still wants to hear what people have to say about cutting the police budget even further. What are your thoughts? You're the police commissioner.
So, prior to the murder of George Floyd, I already directed substantial reductions to the Portland Police Bureau, as I did with all of our city bureaus. Then I put forth some proposals for reinvestment in the community. My colleagues on the city council had other ideas and broader ideas. We reached a compromise. In total, between the reductions that I directed as a result of the economic slowdown associated with COVID, plus the work that the council did, which we unanimously supported, we reduced the Portland Police Bureau budget by $27 million. That is substantial. So any further reductions are going to have to clear a very high bar from my perspective. What I'm hearing is I go out, just this last week I met with small business owners and operators and some community leaders in the Gateway District and in the outer Southeast Foster area. The week before, I met with some minority business owners and operators in Old Town Chinatown, and all of them told me the same thing. They said they need more police presence. They said they need faster response times. They said that they were concerned that any further reductions in the Portland Police Bureau budget could actually lead to longer response times. And of course, we have this pandemic, and I'm using this word intentionally, we have this pandemic of gun violence in our community that may in fact require additional investments. We have the Police Bureau engaging more investigative resource towards getting their arms around the gun violence, and I'm making the case to my colleagues that we should increase funding for the Office of Violence Prevention so that they can work with their coalition of 20 community partners to help engage people who are impacted directly by gun violence. People are also asking for additional training. That costs money. So from my perspective, we should consider all options. We should certainly engage the community at this time. But for me, it's going to have to be a very high bar that's going to have to be cleared before somebody can make the case to me that further reductions are either needed, warranted, or appropriate, given the real public safety needs in this community.
What's that bar?
For me, somebody's going to have to prove that further reductions will actually increase community safety. And right now what I'm hearing from people is they're concerned about slow response times. You just heard the chief explain that as long as people are engaged in multiple activities all across the city, it makes it difficult for our police bureau to respond in real time. Look, one final comment on this. We know what we need to do collectively to address all of these problems. And we know that we have the roadmap in our hands right now. We need to end the nightly violence. We need to redeploy our police officers back to the neighborhood precincts where they're urgently needed. We need to find compassionate and quick ways to get as many people off of our sidewalks as possible and connected with humane care. We need to clean up the litter and the graffiti and the broken glass. And then we need to work with our business owners and operators, large and small business owners and operators and community leaders and others to reopen our city as quickly and safely as possible as we can under the COVID restrictions. And we're doing all of those things. My administration is aggressively doing these things. We're working with community partners, and collectively we're already making good progress. And that includes just the other day announcing our downtown revitalization plan. And that goes hand in hand with our efforts throughout the neighborhoods in the city of Portland to clean it up and open it up.
So time for one or two more questions that comes to you.
Dan Carvey with KG News.
Hey, Dan.
The president tweeted 5 times this morning about Portland, about the demonstrations overnight, once again calling on federal officers to get involved in the city. Have there been any discussions with the White House this morning, and with the election less than a month away, do you expect conversations to happen?
Look, I have not had any conversations with the White House this morning. The president's tweets about what happened here in Portland last night underscore the inadvisability of the activities that people were engaged in last night, because it's given the president once again an opportunity to potentially put Native American communities at risk. That said, we have local partners in federal law enforcement here. I maintain communications with those law enforcement partners. I am open to their ideas and suggestions. I'm not going to push anyone from the table. But what I know that we don't want to do is go back to the kind of federal intervention that we had a month and a half ago, where for 2.5 weeks they were here re-engaging and reigniting the demonstrations in our community. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying they started it. I'm not saying there wasn't violence before they got here. There most certainly was. But I'm saying the tactics that they used when they were here were so overbearing that they stirred the pot, they kicked the hornet's nest, they increased the number of people on our streets, and they really ratcheted up the violence and criminal destruction that we'd seen in the community. So that's not the kind of intervention I'm interested in. But if they have thoughtful, balanced ideas about how they can work in conjunction with state and local law enforcement to help us get behind this time of violence and criminal destruction on our streets, I'd be a fool to push them away, and I won't.
Time for one more question.
I'll be fast. They've been waiting, and I've been talking endlessly. Yeah.
Yes, Brian Kirk from the KGW.
It's good to see you.
Homelessness and more people on the streets. Is there a plan or a plan of action to get people off the streets?
Yes.
There's just not enough beds. And have you kind of divorced yourself from that office, or is it hard to sort of divorce yourself from that office and leave maybe to somebody else in charge of it?
Yeah, so let me answer those in rapid sequence. Number one, I've not divorced myself from the Joint Office of Homeless Services. What I've done is I've asked them to work with me and engage to do better. The Joint Office, the city and the county arrangement where we share resources and we share support, and we actually have one director who helps coordinate all of our homeless services, does many good things. We have doubled our shelter space in recent years. We've increased transitional services. We've done a better job, I think, of connecting mental health and substance abuse services to people who are on the streets. I'm really proud of the work that we're doing recently around addressing chronic homelessness, in particular the 2 navigation centers. They're not just shelters. People come in and they're connected to services that can help them not only get off the streets but stay off the streets. And for those who won't come in to the centers, we've actually gone out into the community with the navigation teams. I support that, but what we need to do more of is acknowledge that in this moment we are in a crisis because the federal government has required us to maintain physical distancing in our shelters. We've lost a lot of our shelter capacity as we had to move people out. So that required us to stand up alternatives, which we have, including 3 managed outdoor camps as well as some other facilities. I've called for more shelter because I see it as a crisis. With more people now on our sidewalks as a result of the pandemic, we need to act with urgency. We need to act as though this is an emergency, not just an ongoing management of the homeless situation scenario. And so I've called for 300 shelter beds over the course of the last couple of weeks. We opened the first 170 of those shelter beds at the Charles Jordan Center and the Mount Scott Community Centers, working with partners, including the Joint Office of Homeless Services and other community providers. And we now have the last 130 beds identified, and we'll be making an announcement about that shortly. So we will have opened 300 new shelter beds at my direction just in the last couple of weeks to get people as humanely and quickly, as many people as possible, off the sidewalks.
So I was going to ask you, you talked about some of these
I'm okay.
flashpoints from last night, and I for 5 months. We've seen it, rinse and repeat. I know it's frustrating for you, but you talk about saying, we know what needs to happen, violence needs to stop. So my question is, what do you think, what can you do, what can the police do to stop the violence? What can Portland do to stop the violence? And what does last night say about your ability to stop violence, say on election night? We're only, a month away from the presidential election and the nights thereafter.
So I'll answer the first and then the second piece. So with regard to your first question, the police are doing what they are doing with their law enforcement partners. Let's put that aside for a moment. I think the most important thing we can do right now as a community is make it clear that if you are in our community and you are engaged in violence or criminal destruction, you are not standing with us. You are opposing us. You are working against our values and our sensibilities as a city. And I know that last night, after people engaged in their acts of criminal destruction and violence, they were bragging about it on social media, and they were celebrating their victory. And I want all of those folks to wake up this morning and realize what they actually did. They actually attacked institutions that support the people they purport to be in the streets marching on behalf of. They are not engaged in any activity that has any relationship whatsoever to racial justice or equity. They are purely engaged in violence and criminal destruction for the sake of violence and criminal destruction. And the more we call them out and the more we shine a light on them and the more that we hold them accountable when they are arrested, that will take some of the impetus out of their nightly activities. I forgot what the other part of your question was. Sorry, it was...
Yes, that answers
Just a sec.
my first question. The other one is just, what does it say about your ability to handle the violence, say, come on election night?
So cities all across the country are obviously preparing for activities during the election. The city of Portland is no exception to that. There's a lot of states that will be using vote by mail for the first time. I think everybody expects that there will definitely be complications or that things may not move as smoothly or as quickly as people would like. We're used to, as Americans, seeing the results come up the night of the election. With vote by mail, sometimes it doesn't work that way. And so here in the city of Portland, I have convened our state law enforcement partners, including our new superintendent of state police, our county law enforcement partners, and the Portland Police Bureau and others to talk about what our unified strategy will be, what our unified plan will be come election day. And we'll be releasing more of those details as we hammer it out. We're putting the final touches on that. We're expanding our opportunities around mutual aid agreements. And an idea that I've put on the table is to create a template mutual aid agreement so we know in advance all of the details of mutual aid, so we're not having last-minute disagreements about who does what, when, how, or under whose directives. We're going to hammer that out in advance, and we're pretty close to finalizing an agreement of that nature. Thank you. Did anybody have a question for Carrie or Representative Sanchez?